Listeners, readers, I'm so glad you've tuned in. Welcome to the Foxed Page, where we dive deep into the very best books. We end up with a much richer understanding of the title at hand, all while you're learning to read everything a little better. I'm Kimberly Ford, best-selling author, one-time adjunct professor at Berkeley, editor, and PhD in Spanish and French literature. And for anyone out there who doesn't actually traffic in rare books, Foxed Page might be something of a mystery, but foxing is simply those little tan spots that you see sometimes on the pages of really old, beloved books. The book we're discussing today, Louise Erdrich's really incredible The Sentence, is not, in fact, all that old, but it really is important and it's timely, and I'm really excited about diving in. In this first chunk today, this first half-hour installment of the lecture, we will be discussing why the book is worth your time. It's really sort of urgent and important and very timely, although I feel like it's going to be an interesting sort of historical capsule of the, the beginning of this decade. And then we'll be talking about Erdrich's really interesting biography. Then we'll dive into the prose. As always, there won't be any spoilers in this first chunk, but in the second and third installments, we will be talking about plot points, so you might want to finish the book before you listen to those. In parts 2 and 3, we will be discussing even more in depth why this novel is just really built on exceptional prose and why it touches on some very important issues. And then, of course, we'll talk about the close of the novel. So let's dive in. For a more immersive experience, you can check out the YouTube channel where you can see me. At this point, I am sitting in front of a lot of books, a lot of really important and good books, because The Sentence is, in fact, so concerned with books and the power of language and the power of books. I should have a big dictionary right in front of me, but I actually do not, in fact, have that. Okay, so we're going to dive into the intro. So one thing that we always bring up when we get together is this question of why this book. We have a lot competing for our attention, and this novel is, in fact, I think, very worth everyone's time. So Erdrich has always been sort of consistently present in the literary landscape. She's written 31 novels. She's 67 years old, 68 years old. But I also really felt like I wanted to include a native voice. So we've, as a country, I think, have been thinking a lot about our legacy, and it felt really important to have a native voice here who really has prose that is worth digging into, and who's also telling a story that is universal, but that also really does feature the experience of the Native American people. I also loved this book in large part because I knew from the timing, and you know this as a reader, right, when you start the book, that COVID and the George Floyd murder is coming. So there's this real sense of urgency at the beginning of the book that I think is magnified by this sense as the reader, that you know what is coming down the pike and you know things are, in fact, not going to get any better. I love that this is set in Minneapolis, where George Floyd was murdered. It was a look at the murder that I just hadn't had, and it's such a great depiction, not only of the pandemic, and that is a huge force throughout the novel, and really affects a lot of aspects of the plot and of our characterization. But there is this very central piece of the murder of George Floyd, and it's a very rich tapestry, if you will, of very much like the quilt and the cover art, which we're going to get to in the second part of the lecture. But you do have this real sense of the Native experience and this ghost that is haunting the bookstore, and this sense of what it is like to be a Native American or of Native American descent, but then also this really strong presence of both COVID and the George Floyd murders. Of course, the prose is incredible. We never read anything that doesn't have excellent prose. And Erdrich is such a brainy and such a literary writer that it's just an absolute pleasure to parse and to really figure out what makes the writing so strong, because a lot of it, in fact, owes a big debt to literature. You know, it's a very sort of intertextual book. There are lots and lots of references, obviously, to other books. So it's really fun as ardent readers, as I know you all are, to read a book that is, in fact, concerned with books. It's also a New York Times bestseller. You guys know how I feel about bestsellers. I tend to shy away from them a bit because oftentimes the prose is not as strong as it could be. In this case, it's an example of a bestseller that absolutely stands up to all of my tests of excellent prose. Okay, we're going to dig in quickly to a little biographical information about Karen Louise Erdrich. She was born in 1954. People go back and forth between Erdrich and Erdrich, but I heard Louise interviewed in a couple of different interviews I've listened to about this book, and in one of them, there's this old gentleman who kept referring to her as Louise Erdrich, and she did not, in fact, correct him. So I'm just going to go with Erdrich. That seems like the safest bet. So she was born in Minnesota. She was the oldest of 7 children. Her mother was a Chippewa woman, and her father was of French descent. So sort of a French colonial, probably Canadian, they're up there in the north. She went to Dartmouth, as did I, and then went to Johns Hopkins University for creative writing. She was married to Michael Doris, who was a professor of hers at Dartmouth College, and he was really instrumental, actually, in sort of inspiring her to write about her native experience and her native roots, and to really dig into that aspect of her biography. He had 3 adopted children at the time who she sort of, I don't know if she officially adopted them, but they certainly became part of her family for some length of time. And then she and Michael Doris had 3 children together, Persia, Pallas, and Asia. Asia, which Louise lets us know in the introduction or in the acknowledgments, she was the one who made the cover art, which is sort of this quilt, which is really, it's a good sort of metaphor for what Erdrich is trying to do in the novel. So Michael Doris, I'm sure many of you are familiar, he wrote a novel that everyone, myself included, really loved back in the day called Yellow Raft and Blue Water. But soon after his literary success and his sort of great standing at Dartmouth College, he fell from grace. I mean, is that one way to say it? I don't know. It seems like a very diplomatic way to say that. He had, with his 3 adopted children, some of whom were Native kids, and they had some fetal alcohol syndrome issues. There was tragedy. One of them, I believe, committed suicide. And then Michael Doris himself actually committed suicide after allegations on the part of his children that he was, in fact, abusing them, I believe sexually. So Michael Doris was highly, highly problematic. This all came out when he was separated from his wife and then from Louise Erdrich, and then committed suicide. On a happier note, Louise Erdrich, again, has written 31 books. She won the National Book Critics Circle for Love Medicine. She won the National Book Award for The Roundhouse, and recently, in 2021, won the Pulitzer Prize for The Watchmen. So I read Love Medicine. I have not read those other 2. For whatever reason, I just haven't been drawn to Erdrich the way that I have been drawn to other writers. This book actually came recommended by one of you old-timey, not old, but just like long-standing members of the seminars, who was really struck by the first sentence of the book. And you all know that I'm a real fan of digging into that first sentence. And this reader sent this to me and said, check out this first sentence. And I did, and in fact was sucked right into the book, which often the first sentence does it for me, one way or the other. I can tell right away whether or not I'm going to love a work. Okay, we're going to dive in, not to that first sentence quite yet, but into the cover art of the novel. So as I just mentioned, Louise Erdrich's daughter, Asia, one of her children with Michael Doris. Oh, actually, I forgot to mention, she also, at the age 47, had another child, a son, and that was with that child she had with an unnamed man. He is married, from all I can tell in my sleuthing, but he's a Native man, and I think really a very sort of passionate love affair for her. But so she did in fact have a 4th child with someone else when she was a little older than she had her 3 daughters. But it was her daughter Asia who made the cover of the book. It's funny, do I love the cover art? I'm not sure that I love it. Do I think it's effective? Yes. I mean, it didn't make me grab the book by any stretch, but I do, in fact, like what is happening here. So I like this idea of all of these edges and these things being sort of disjointed. So you have a lot of significance, I think, here in this idea of all of these sharp angles. This is very sort of Tookie in lots of ways. And there's this sense of sort of halves of things being missing and things fitting together in interesting ways, which certainly describes a lot of the ways that the characters in the novel are reacting with one another. I like the idea of the quilt as a metaphor for the novel. I mentioned this briefly before, but there is an idea of a quilt traditionally as being something made of remnants, so smaller pieces of other pieces of fabric. You don't have quite enough to make curtains or a dress, and so you save all of these bits and pieces and put them together into a quilt. I love the idea of that being partially what our narrator Tookie is doing as she is stitching together the story of her life and her love affair and her struggles to get along with her stepdaughter, together with COVID, with her experience of the George Floyd murder. I like the significance of the cover art. I also think it's noteworthy that Louise Erdrich's name is kind of this giant thing, and then down at the bottom, almost as an afterthought, we have the sentence. So you know that you have really made it. You know that an author has really become an institution when their name is significantly larger and comes above the name of the book. I do like to, winner of the Pulitzer Prize, again, that refers to Louise, not down here. So she's, and the Pulitzer Prize is oftentimes awarded to a book as opposed to the Man Booker, which is slightly more kind of literary. The Pulitzer is often a book that's very topical, and I do think that Erdrich is she's very good at writing books that, in fact, are very topical and timely and are not afraid of really tackling some large issues faced by our nation. We are going to then open up the book here, and we're going to pass right by all of these blurbs in the beginning. One thing that I really love here is this disclaimer. So if you are like me, which I'm not sure that all of you read exactly the way that I do, I like to read through this kind of boilerplate stuff because often you'll be rewarded with some little nugget that's in this part. So I like the part here that says, any resemblance to actual events, locales, organizations, or persons living or dead is entirely coincidental, except for the dictionary and the ghost. So I love this in part because there's sort of a cheekiness to this. There's a little bit of a wink wink here. The dictionary we learn from the I don't know if it's in the introduction or I think it's in the acknowledgments in the back. The dictionary is something real that Louise Erdrich has in her possession. It was a very important possession for her as a youth. I think as a young writer or young college student, I can't quite recall now. But this idea of the dictionary as being something very real, and then I love the idea that she is equating that to this ghost. So there's nothing in the novel to let us sort of believe or lead us to believe that there is skepticism where the ghost is concerned. There's very much this sense. It's much like Beloved. There are lots of books. There's an excellent book called The Bookshop, actually, by Penelope Fitzgerald, where ghosts are just, I mean, there are many examples of this throughout literature, where ghosts are just, they're a given. It's not whether or not there is a ghost, it's just what the ghost represents. And I think that ghosts of Native American peoples, because in many ways we are haunted as a nation, as we very well should be, this idea of the ghost, whether or not you want to read this as like an actual ghost story versus, the presence of people who have suffered greatly and certainly unjustly, I think it's a very compelling way to sort of to have some sense of culpability as a nation. But I also like the sentence before the one about the dictionary and the ghost, any resemblance to actual events, locales, organizations, or persons, living or dead, is entirely coincidental. That obviously is very disingenuous because we have Minneapolis and we have these historical figures and we have George Floyd and we have organizations and locales that actually in fact do exist. So it's this nice kind of interplay with this very metafictive notion, and metafiction is simply a way to talk in a novel about the book or about the process of writing. It's this very sort of meta thing where she's acknowledging, yes, this is boilerplate stuff. Everyone in the novels has to say, hey, this is all made up, so that they can avoid being sued by anyone. When that is one of those kind of, it's a convention that we have that in lots of ways means nothing. In this litigious society of ours, you need to have, that kind of security. But obviously she's playing with this notion because there are certainly people like George Floyd and like the city of Minneapolis who are in fact very, very, very real and feel very real in the novel as well. The presence is very felt in the novel. And in fact, it's one of the things I like the best is when you have a historical figure or you have an actual locale, it really does help to bring some verisimilitude, a sense of reality to the fictive world. We're going to move on quickly here to the dedication to everyone who has worked at Birch Bark Books, to our customers, and to our ghosts. I love the fact that the ghost there is plural. It makes me feel, I do not think that Louise Erdrich should follow this with any kind of a sequel. She actually was asked that question in an interview I heard from a bookseller at Barnes & Noble, and this idea of whether or not like sort of Tookie's backstory could be developed into a novel or whether she would continue to write about these characters. And happily, in my opinion, Louise was like, no. I mean, she did not say it like that. She was much more diplomatic. But I think she sees this, I think, for what it is, which is a very rich and very kind of deeply, richly told novel that is just, as far as I am concerned, it is just the one novel. But I do love the idea of there being other ghosts and both in the novel and in real life, Louise Erdrich's home is said also to be haunted. Again, I like the emphasis here about Birch Bark Books. You have a sense there of Birch Bark, you have a sense of place, a sense of Minneapolis, and it's a little bit of a nod, I think, to nature in the sense that nature in the Native American culture would have been was prized, and so there is a nod to what is owed to the land here. But I also love this emphasis about books and booksellers and book readers, just because it's so delightful to read books that are, about something so near and dear to our hearts. So then we get to this epigraph. I love this epigraph. So this is written by a Korean-American poet. Her name is Sun Young Shin. This is from something called Unbearable Splendor. And the epigraph is, from the time of birth to the time of death, every word you utter is part of one long sentence. So she also was the writer at one point, or she is the author of an essay in 2016 called A Good Time for the Truth, Race in Minneapolis, which is haunting in the sense that this is something that came 2016, well before the George Floyd murder. So there, Minneapolis has been, for a long time has had a reputation of racial strife, and it's kind of this eerie sense of this woman as having had, along with many other people, a sense of trouble sort of brewing there that came to a head, in fact, with George Floyd. But this is obviously an echo of the title of the book. So this idea of your life being one long sentence, immediately my mind goes to like, wait, how are we going to punctuate that? Because that is going to call for a lot of semicolons and a lot of em dashes being my favorite punctuation mark of all time. But there's this sense of like, whoa, wait, there is this sense of, it's such a great line because it gives us this sense of life as being so finite. It's this one sentence, and yet also this sense of wait, life is pretty long, and fitting it all into one sentence would be tricky. So it's this very nice simultaneous reminder of life exactly the way it feels, which is some days it feels very long and some days it feels like it's flying by. So I really, I think it's a very well-chosen epigraph. Again, we're going to talk about the title in the second part, which is kind of unusual for us, but the title is so central, and it comes up again and again. The idea of the sentence comes up again and again in the novel, so we need plenty of space to be able to really dive in. So we're moving on next to this this section title. So many of you know that I am, my memory, first of all, is really, really bad, but I also tend to be kind of lazy about reading titles of sections. So if it's a chapter title, if it is a section title like this, for whatever reason, I think my like eagerness to jump into the text is such that I tend to sort of skim over them. But I really like this. So this idea of time in, time out, there's this idea of both being in and out, which has to do with so many people in the novel, just in terms of their lives and the way that these characters function. Whether Tuki's husband is in or out of the police force, whether he's in or out of the Native American organization that he belongs to, whether Tuki is in or out of prison, whether people are in or out of the bookstore, whether they're in or out of families. So there is this sense of belonging and in and out. But obviously, time in, you do have this sense of time served. And then time out, you also have that sense of like, you need a time out, or I need a time out, or let's take a time out. So there's this really nice sense here of a lot to parse from every single piece of this. I like it also in my marginalia here. I wrote a line between time in / time out. For some reason, I wanted to have that delineation, but I very much like the fact that Louise did not. It's time in, time out is all it's all blurred together, which is obviously very purposeful on her part. I also I'm interested in these little marks that are throughout the book. So I don't even know if you notice them as a reader, but they're these little space breaks that occur with these little squares. One thing to note is that they echo the quilted cover of the book, if I can extend the quilting metaphor. You have the little square that is totally reminiscent of the cover art, and in fact, you even have this idea of it being split in half. Again, time in, time out. This idea of black and white, this idea of division. So even these small pieces of the novel are really resonant. So one quick note, in case you don't know this as a reader, oftentimes you'll see, if you're reading a book and it has lots of space breaks, then occasionally you'll come across an asterisk at the bottom of a page. So what that asterisk is meant to signal to you is that there should be a page break or a space break, but you don't notice it because you're at the end of a page. So sometimes I think when I was younger, I'd be like, wait, why are there asterisks sometimes and other times just a space break? If the asterisks are only occurring at the bottom of pages, then you can be pretty sure that the author simply means a space break, and the editor has inserted these to let you know, even at the bottom of a page, that there's meant to be a space break. But in this case, Erdrich is not doing that. There is not, they're used throughout. So she has them at different points. Sometimes we have just a space break. Sometimes we have a space break with a small section title. So we have this large time in, time out section, but then if we turn the page, we see earth to earth. So there's this, you have the small section headings, you have the larger section headings, and you have lots of these little squares that are divided in half that are kind of sprinkled throughout. And I think that we could do some very profound and sort of very revealing analysis of why sometimes we simply have a space break, why we have a heading, why we have a title, why we have the little box thing. But I have not done, in fact, that research, that analysis. So somebody out there, you want to get after that and let me know, that'd be great. But I can tell you that I think if someone did take the time, it would reveal, in fact, that Erdrich has a very intricate and sort of profound sense of organization in the novel. One other quick note, we're going to talk about postmodernism later in section 2, I believe, if not section 3 of the lecture. And postmodernism, one of the things that is characterized, or that characterizes a postmodernist work, is simply this idea of sort of pointing out or constantly reminding the reader that he or she is reading something, and what they are reading is artifice. So it's the opposite of realism, where Flaubert or Henry James is wanting you to sort of really sink into a world and kind of like forget that you are reading something. You're so immersed, and the details are so rich, and the prose is so fluid, and the narrator is so omniscient that you're simply kind of lost in this world. Postmodernism, which follows modernism, and in that case, modernism is like, Virginia Woolf, and it's Faulkner, and it's people who really sought to disrupt this idea of the realist novel. Well, realism led to naturalism, which then led to modernism. So especially during the World Wars, the idea of the sort of traditional novel did not work for people anymore, because that kind of omniscient, lose yourself in a world felt sort of too naive, given all of the tumult in the world. So modernism reflected that and really brought to the fore a lot of very experimental work. Postmodernism brings us back to kind of a hyper-realism, where you are meant to be very, very aware of the fact that you are reading something. Often postmodernism has kind of a social critique, like a satirical piece to it, and lots of place names come up, and lots of sort of advertising, and there's a real critique lots of times of consumerism. So part of the project of postmodernism is to sort of keep you aware of the fact that you are reading something that you have purchased for, in my case here, I guess $19 probably. Oh yes, $19, but I have not done, in fact, that research. And let me tell you, anyone who's like, oh my God, this hardback book costs $26, all you have to do is amortize that $26 over all of the hours for which you are going to enjoy that book, and you will know that buying even a hardback book is an absolute bargain. So my $19 was well spent, but part of Erdrich's sort of postmodernist bent it is to keep us aware of the fact that we are reading something that is an artifice. It's artificial. It's not, in fact, a real world. And part of the way she does that is by, fooling around a little bit with the boilerplate disclaimer. And it's having a dedication followed by an epigraph with little marks, and then it's having these different, large titles and smaller titles. So as the reader, these sort of stops and starts, and these different, even typographical, different fonts and whatnot, remind us of the fact that we are reading something that is in fact constructed by someone who has some sort of political agenda, which is often the case with postmodernism. We're going to take a quick look here at page 3, and then we're going to close for today, or at least for section 1. Feel free to dive right on in to sections 2 and 3. But I really love this earth to earth. After time in, time out, and with this idea of the sentence and knowing that there is a ghost involved in the story, if you read the little summary on the back or heard anything at all about the novel, this earth to earth idea, I really like the resonance there. Again, this is something we could parse, for an entire 90 minutes. It has kind of a, like ashes to ashes, dust to dust feel. So there is this sense of death, which I think is very timely because we are in a moment of ecological crisis, totally unprecedented. So this idea of earth to earth is that sense of like ashes to ashes, dust to dust, earth to earth, this real pervasive kind of gravitas right at the start, this real kind of threat to all of humanity in many ways. You also get this kind of like, Earth to Mars or whatever that sort of like that cosmological thing is that right? Astronautical thing that we say, or like somebody would be like Earth to Kimberly, that kind of thing. So this Earth to Earth idea also gives us this sense of trying to communicate. There are lots of different ways that we could parse this. Okay, but instead of parsing it further, we are going to dive in. While in prison, I received a dictionary. It was sent to me with a note. This is the book I would take to a deserted island. So I love the italics here. I love the fact that Louise Erdrich uses this, that the teacher in this book, Tookie's teacher, is using this correctly. When people say desert island, I'm always like, oh my God, I'm going to have to correct mentally. I'm going to have to silently in my head correct your expression there, because desert island, it just doesn't make any sense. Deserted island is the more correct one, although you sound like a total asshole if you make that kind of correction. So just make it silently in your mind, and thank you, Louise, for getting this correct here. Other books were to arrive from my teacher, but as she had known, this one proved of endless use. The first word I looked up was the word sentence. I had received an impossible sentence of 60 years from the lips of a judge who believed in the afterlife. So this is the sense of, we're going to just pause there briefly. While I was in prison, I received a dictionary. So right from the start, we have this sense of someone being in prison and no longer being in prison, which is important because this is the story of sort of a next chapter. Again, sort of a split in her life, time in, time out. But I received, there's an inflated diction in the beginning there that I really love because our Tookie has read, with I think she says with a vengeance or with a vehemence or something like that, while she is in prison. And we know she's always been a bright kid. She takes an IQ test when she's young and she's very smart, but has not received a lot of education. And so this sense of having books and having things at her disposal allow her to, conjure up a phrase like, I received a dictionary, which is very different than I got a dictionary. And also, of course, this idea of words, a dictionary as a repository of words, but also as a kind of manual of words is very significant. We talk a lot in these lectures about how the last word in a sentence, or the last word certainly in a paragraph or a chapter, and certainly a book, takes on more weight. So in this case, dictionary really does sort of, there's a nice sense of emphasis there on dictionary. Okay, and then we're going to get into what I love here, which is talk about parsing. We're going to really get into some linguistics here, where we will talk about the sentence. I had received an impossible sentence of 60 years from the lips of a judge who believed in an afterlife. So the word, with its yawning C, belligerent little E's, with its hissing sibilants and double N's, this repetitive bummer of a word made of slyly stabbing letters that surrounded an isolate human T. This word was in my thoughts every moment of every day. So I think this is largely why that longtime seminar goer sent this to me. I often like to look at the linguistics of words because it's kind of a miniature exercise of how I think that the best reading happens. We're parsing the very kind of units that excellent prose is made up of. And in this case, this is not like a full linguistic analysis except for the sibilants there. But you have this sense of, this yawning C. I like the idea of looking at the words, the belligerent little E's. I'm not sure I think E's are particularly belligerent, but maybe kind of, all spread out like that, like a small little army of E's. With its hissing sibilants and double N's. And I love that she's saying hissing sibilants, because a sibilant is that S sound, but of course hissing sibilants is making really good use of, in fact, sibilants. So you have that kind of meta feel. You also then have an echo of all of those sibilants with the slyly stabbing letters. And not only do we have this repetition of the sibilants, that hissing S sound, but we also have repetition of the E's and the T's. So you have the sense of sentence as being kind of repeated over and over and over in the reader's mind in a way that's very much like what is happening in Tookie's mind. Okay, and then of course we have an isolate human T. So you have the T, it's kind of I like the fact that it's standing taller than this little army of all of these, hissing, malignant little letters. But it also, of course, the T is a T for Tookie. It's her nickname. It's the first letter in her nickname. This word was in my thoughts every moment of every day. Without a doubt, had the dictionary not arrived, this light word that lay so heavily upon me would have crushed me, or what was left of me after the strangeness of what I had done. So again, we have this excellent sibilant word here, the strangeness. It actually is more like sentence. It has some E's and some T's and some N's and the S's. So you have this nice echo in strangeness of the word sentence. But what I love about it, this is a very powerful end of a first paragraph, the strangeness of what I'd done. There is no way, again, I received this first paragraph, a photograph of it, a scan of it from one of you all, and there was no way that I was not going to read this book because I was like, what is the strangeness that she has done? So it's very powerful. I like the fact that there is a space break here because it adds, in fact, to kind of the weight of this of the strangeness and this kind of cliffhangery end to that first paragraph. So speaking of cliffhangery ends, that will bring us to the close of our first section, but do tune in for our second section of this series, where we will talk about the title of the work, the sentence. We'll talk about postmodernism, and we'll talk about the excellent use of names. In the third section, again, we'll be discussing maternity, a few faults that I will nitpick at, just a tiny little bit of that, and then we will, as always, look at the close of the novel. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope you like the book, and I hope that my thoughts are helping elucidate a little more why, in fact, this book is so popular and so important. Listeners, readers, welcome back to part 2 of our 3-part lecture on Louise Erdrich's very important novel, The Sentence. Today we're going to be discussing the title of the work, which I think is excellent. We're going to be discussing postmodernism and the importance of names and how deftly Erdrich maneuvers them in this work. Okay, we're going to dive in with the idea of the title. So, of course, the sentence, we have this sense right from the beginning that it refers to Tuki's sentence. So she makes a very big deal of that right in that very first paragraph about how she receives this sentence, and she does a nice parsing of the sort of linguistic pieces of that book. But right before that, we also have that beautiful epigraph where we have this idea of your life as being one long sentence. So what we have here is this interesting conflation of a life sentence as being both like your entire life is this one long sentence, as posited by this Korean American poet who lives in Minneapolis and writes about race, but you also have this idea of a life sentence, as that being something that is significantly served in prison. So, and lots of times that idea of a life sentence is really points to the very, very grave problems in our judicial system, because oftentimes, weirdly, you can receive like 3 life sentences. And I mean, I understand how these things are meted out. I mean, I am no Kim Kardashian. I am not I love the Kardashians, by the way, but I am not practicing to be or studying to be a lawyer. But I understand, the sort of the larger idea about life sentences and why it would be important to give someone 3 of them. But it does sort of point to this sort of farcical nature of what our criminal system is doing to people. But we also have this idea of the sentence as being a work within a work. So we have this actual work. There is a piece of writing that is inside the book. It's a very sort of Shakespearean, notion, this idea of the play within the play. Here we have a sort of a text or a manuscript within the manuscript that takes on lots of significance. So we are going to page 70. This is a conversation about the sentence that Tuki is having with Louise. So one of the elements of the book that feels postmodernist to me is this idea of Louise Erdrich herself entering into the text, and she's entering very much as herself. She's an author. She lives in Minneapolis. She runs a bookstore. So you have this sense of, and she has daughters. You have this sense of the author as entering into the book, not as the author, but as a fictive person. So again, you've got that disclaimer that's like, any of these people who seem like they're real are not real, when in fact Louise herself is entering into the text. So again, that postmodernist idea of pointing out the artificiality of the text, which actually makes it feel sort of truer in some ways. So here we're having a conversation between Tuki and Louise about books as being very, very potent. In fact, one of the sentences in the sentence having killed Flora. Louise says, "Books aren't meant to be safe. Sadly or heroically, depending on the way you look at it, books do kill people. In places where books are forbidden, of course, but not here." This is Tuki talking. "Not yet, knock wood." So I love this idea that Tuki has this sense of like, if you ban books or forbid books, that's when books can kill people. What I'm trying to say is that a certain sentence of the book, a written sentence, a very powerful sentence, killed Flora. Louise was silent. After a few moments, she spoke. "I wish I could write a sentence like that." So I love this idea of this humor here. I mean, it's this very kind of sad and powerful and interesting moment of grief and fear on the part of Tookie. And then it's kind of deflated by this excellent, envious kind of reaction on Louise's part, which is like, oh, I wish I could kill someone with my writing. I wish I could be that powerful. So I love it in part because it is Louise Erdrich herself who is saying this. So again, we have this kind of layer upon layer upon layer of an author who is in the book, who is writing about the process of writing a book, and in fact referring to a manuscript that is inside of the book. So you have all of these kind of different layers to it, but I do just love, that was really a very funny piece in a book that isn't kind of overflowing with humor, but that has a lot of levity in places where that is very important. Okay, we're gonna look at page 347. We have a slight widening of the idea of the sentence. It's sort of coming full circle to this idea of the sentence, the type of sentence that Tookie is discussing in the very first paragraph. On the top of 347, the thing is, most of us Indigenous people do have to consciously pull together our identities. We've endured centuries of being erased and sentenced to live in a replacement culture. So even someone raised strictly in their own tradition gets pulled toward white perspectives. So again, this idea of being sentenced to something, as a non-native American, wow, that is a mouthful. It's difficult for me to even begin to comprehend the idea of being sort of sentenced in the way that Native American peoples were, Indigenous peoples were, without any kind of justice. I mean, it was an absolute travesty of justice. It was genocide that occurred, but it was a kind of sentence. They were serving a sort of sentence, in that case, a death sentence. So toward the end of the novel, we have this really beautiful sort of turning. We've discussed the sentence as like a prison sentence, and the sentence as being your entire life, and this idea of the sentence as a captivity narrative that's within this novel called The Sentence. But toward the end of the book, we're widening back out toward these sort of larger ideas, not just that one text, that manuscript, but the wider idea. And in fact, we're moving toward this idea of this beautiful sentence, the most beautiful sentence in the English language, or in the human language, that will allow for some sort of a ritual, some sort of a transforming magical ritual. Again, really getting to the heart of language as being incredibly potent. Okay, so on 349, this is Penstemon talking to Tookie about how they might rid the store of Flora's ghost. One time you said something about the most beautiful sentence in the human language, said Penn. As you know, I'm big on ritual. Maybe she needs one. What you're really referring to is the meaning of the sentence in any language, right? I suppose I am. Then I know what she wants to hear. So I love the idea of this younger generation as being very wise, and of Tookie as learning a lot from these people. I mean, they seem totally preposterous in many ways. Lawrence, I think that's his name, Jarvis, Laurent, maybe? He's a descendant of the French sort of colonializers up there in Canada. But you have the sense of the younger generation as sort of stepping up with some wisdom. And Penstemon, all Asima, you would expect actually that people who work in bookstores, especially younger people working in bookstores, would be really interesting, wise young people. So you have this sense here of her coming up with this idea of this perfect sentence. So then if we go to 355 and 356, we're not going to look at the very end of the novel, but just the idea of this sentence and the potency, in fact, of this sentence. We're going to read quite a few chunks here on 355. So this is Tookie who's reading. I read words out slowly in Latin that was probably painful to hear until I reached the crucial ending. Then, in firm tones, I said, Ego te absolvo. There was a suspension, a silence, a weighty sense of consideration. Then together, we spoke one of the loveliest sentences in the English language. Go in peace. Nothing. She was still there. So I love this idea of the meaning of the sentence as being important and not the language. So they begin in Latin. That doesn't work. So then they say together, go in peace, which is, it's interesting. Ego te absolvo, it means rest in peace. It also means I absolve you, I forgive you. So this idea of go in peace, not rest in peace. Wow, they've already said that about Flora. Here they're saying go in peace, but she's still there. So there is this sense of like, we still need something else. This is a beautiful sentence, but we need something else. A little further down, Tookie says, wait a minute. I do know her favorite sentence. Listen. I had talked about Proust the day before, and in fact, once I'd memorized a sentence that I knew Flora loved as much as I did. A little tap on the window pane. And then I'm going to skip a bunch of stuff. It was the rain. So this is the sentence that she's reading from Proust. This is one of my little nits that I'm going to have to pick later with this characterization of Tookie. I do totally buy that Tookie is very well read, but some of the things that she's quoting seem to me a little too convenient. It seems like something that Louise was in fact wanting to incorporate in the novel that seemed very apt, and she just went ahead and gave it to Tookie, which maybe. If that was not jarring for you or didn't cause any kind of skepticism, then that's great. Okay, so she says it was the rain. So she reads this beautiful sentence from Proust, nothing. But I could feel her listening the way you feel it when an audience draws near. It was the rain. So then down she's going to say another sentence, and if her Latin was painful to hear, this is also going to be painful to hear. M'igwech a paigi, Flora. So she says in indigenous language. I pitched my voice in that special register that expresses something true, however grating, or sells something broken. Thank you for saving my life. So there's this beautiful sense of trying these different things. Maybe it's go in peace in Latin from that tradition. Maybe it's a piece of literature. Maybe it's Proust. And it's not in fact that. And in fact, it is this thank you spoken in this native language that is what Flora in fact needs to hear. So the important thing here being they're trying these different sentences that are these very sort of weighty and important sentences from these different traditions. And finally, it is the native language that is the one that is, in fact, what Flora needed to hear in order to be at peace. So she's speaking again here to just like the incredible power of words, the incredible power of the sentence, and not a life sentence, but the idea of what we can construct out of language. Okay, we're going to move on to this idea of postmodernism, and then we're going to briefly discuss the importance of names. So I've touched on postmodernism already a bit, but I'm going to just quickly walk through a few things. So it was interesting to me, and I don't think I would have automatically put Louise Erdrich in this category of postmodernist, but when you look at her Wikipedia, which I always do, and that's where I begin my sleuthing, it has her as a postmodernist writer, which was interesting, and I think it actually inflected the way that I read this book. She does have a lot of elements of postmodernism, but I think I associate postmodernism with a slightly stricter definition of writing that happened in the sort of late 60s and early 70s, frankly, by a lot of hyper-intellectual men who were hyper-intellectualizing everything. But we do see lots of the elements. One is this metafiction, this idea of writing about the writing. So, busting into that boilerplate thing, or having, talking about the sentence and the sentence and the sentence and all these iterations. We have self-reflexivity, which is sort of that same idea that, we have, Louise, who is the author of this book. Her name is right there on the front of the cover, but it also is the name of a bookseller who happens to be a writer who is a character in the novel. Intertextuality, this book has that, up to its eyeballs. There's constant references to different books. One of the ways that Flora is, lets Tookie know her real name is by tossing down different books that all have the name Lily in them, because that is in fact Tookie's real name. So you have this sense of intertextuality as being very important. At the end there, we see the Proust. There are all sorts of different references to different books that sort of save lives or kill people, frankly. And in the end, in fact, you have those really excellent lists of books that were so fun to check out. You also often have an unreliable narrator, and I liked that idea. In postmodernism, usually do. I don't find Tookie unreliable, but I like the idea of her as I like the idea of sort of needing to be suspicious of her, because she herself says, "I love to lie. This is a problem. I'm constantly lying." But we sort of have this sense, at least I did. Call me naive, maybe I missed a bunch of stuff, as being kind of on the inside. We're close enough to who she is and close enough to sort of her journey of redemption, and her love affair with Pollux, and how she's struggling with Hedda, to really feel like she is, in fact, a fairly reliable narrator. But you also have lots of intrusion of the real world in postmodernism, and we certainly see that here. We have Minneapolis, we have various different books, we have book selling ideas, we have the idea of, taxes, all these different kinds of things that come up, that feel like real world kind of issues. And often postmodernism will challenge authority, and certainly this book is doing that. So there are lots of, when there is writing about the riots that happen, not riots, the very important protests that happen after George Floyd's murder, you have this sense of being very closely aligned and being very sympathetic to these young protesters who are out there, risking their lives in the midst of COVID, to really take a stand and to call attention to the injustice here. So this book does challenge authority in lots of different ways, and in ways that I think are very convincing and very powerful. And again, we touched on these things briefly, but there are lots of different ways the text itself calls attention, with the little space break things, with the different fonts. But one thing we didn't talk about yet is this idea of this slapstick quality. So in the beginning, in particular, I had these real notions of like Kurt Vonnegut and especially Thomas Pynchon, who are postmodernist writers, especially Pynchon. He's kind of like the big postmodernist. There's a lot of sort of slapsticky stuff that happens in there, because one of the things that is helping them be sort of meta-fictive or remind us that what we're reading is artifice is by using all of these sort of tropes. It's not exactly someone slipping on a banana peel, but kind of in that vein. And the main way that I saw that with Tookie was in these verbs that she was using when she was talking about this crime that she commits by moving this body, essentially becoming a body snatcher, and it happens to have the drugs in the armpits. So we have these very kind of stagey verbs, ones like sprawl and gouge and clobber and howl and flung. Especially clobber, you have this sense of it as being sort of evoking like comic strips, or like Laurel and Hardy, this idea of clobbering someone and sprawling. So there's a sense of exaggeration in these very powerful verbs that make that whole first section, that whole first description of her crime, as being very sort of slapsticky and exaggerated in a way that again, this is sort of another story within the story, but that sense of postmodernist, pointing to the artifice of the text by, incorporating these words that have lots of sort of overtones of other tropes, of these sort of cartoon tropes and these exaggerated tropes. Okay, and then we are going to move on from the postmodernist elements, and we are going to discuss very briefly the way that Erdrich is so deft with her choice of names. So Erdrich makes this very important statement about the importance of names. And this was in an interview that I heard when she was talking about the sentence, that there is your given name, which is important, but even more important is sort of your dreamed name. And that dreamed name is often kind of a reflection of your soul, or of your true essence. So Tookie is a sort of a dreamed name, or a sort of a given name, which we're going to discuss in just a second. But it is not, in fact, a given name. And the given name in Tookie's case, in fact, is very difficult for her to hear, which we'll discuss when we talk about the very close of the novel in the third installment of the seminar. But we have these really beautiful, sort of very significant names. So we have Pollux, which is one of the stars in Gemini. And so again, you have this idea of duality and this idea of halves. and this idea of Gemini being the twin, of he being very connected with Tookie in a way that is very, very significant. We have Pollux himself says at one point, a name can be very powerful. And in the tradition of Native American peoples, there is this sense of names as being very significant and names as being much more kind of evocative. And so it's very fitting, in fact, that Pollux has the name of a star. There is something very kind of, cosmic and very sort of earthy in that evocation of Gemini. And then for Tookie is one of these kinds of, it was so interesting to research that name because there wasn't a very sort of clear association. I mean, I had a lot of different associations, but most of them felt kind of Yiddish, which was kind of strange. But this idea of Tookus, the buttocks, and it was a last name that was from sort of the late 1800s. So maybe this is a name that Tookie or Tookus maybe that was an important name in Minnesota. But there is a sense of playfulness and a sense of sort of ridiculousness about Tookie. There's also that idea of something being taken, that something, if you took something, that the name in fact was taken from her. So, and Pallas, Pallas, is a girl's name meaning wisdom. Pollux is that star of Gemini. It comes from the Greek. It's another name for crown or for, it's like Athena. It's kind of a male version of Athena. Then we have Hedda, which is a girl's name, a German name. It's kind of a contemporary name, which I think speaks to some of the, this immigrant population that came to Minnesota, this idea of this real mix of people, and names, again, being important. It tells you quite a bit about, this person's lineage, like Laurent as being, from this sort of colonial French group. And then we have Asima, which is a very powerful name. It means a home ruler. Importantly, Asima also means one who works with tobacco in the native tradition. So that would be sort of a healer kind of a role from the little that I know of that tradition. So, and then we have Jarvis, which is a servant spear, which is it's interesting because Laurent was wanting to sort of be, that was going to be his name, Jarvis, and his forefathers, that was one of their names. But this idea of the spear, this idea of something, it's like there's a little bit of a Cupid's arrow kind of thing, because Jarvis, in fact, really does pierce the heart of our Tookie and really does become, very important to her. But also you get this sense of Jarvis as being a real future warrior. I mean, he's the daughter of someone, for all we can tell here, sort of a very powerful single mom type person who is, not afraid to have this baby and not afraid to show up at very important protests, even in the midst of COVID. So then we have the actual name of our Tookie, which is Lily. So there is this nice sense of Lily as being an echo of Flora, but Lily, it can be purity. So it's often symbolic of innocence but also of strength. So you have this sense of Flora as being kind of a generic flower. Flora and fauna, this is just sort of the idea of any flower, whereas Lily is a much more kind of specific name. In many ways, it didn't resonate for me. Tookie didn't seem like a lily to me, but because I think there's something sort of delicate about the name Lily, and purity and innocence also does not speak to me. So there is this sense of a name like Tookie as being kind of the more authentic name for that person. And then, so her mother, in fact, we know that her name was Charlotte Beaupré, and Beaupré means beautiful meadow. Charlotte, importantly, Charlotte is a feminine version of Charles, which means free man. So you have this sense of her mother, who was absent from Tookie's life, this Charlotte person, as being absent in large part because she was high all the time, but this sense of her as being free because she is not weighed down by any responsibilities in the world. She's free in large part because she was on drugs, and then she is free in many ways because she is dead. There's also a large amount of not exactly kind of cynicism there, but is she free? I'm not sure if you can really say that. So there's kind of an irony to this idea of her as being an iteration of Charles, which means free man. On 136, the significance of Tookie's name is coming further to the fore. So we're sort of, a third of the way into the book, and she's speaking with Jackie, who she works with at the bookstore. And the question of her name comes up, and she obfuscates here. So she says to Jackie, "I don't even know where I got the name Tookie." And then Jackie says, "Didn't realize it was your nickname. What's your real name?" And then there's a little shuffling around, and she says, "I can't remember. Maybe I saw it on some official forms a few times," I said. "But do you know I've blocked it out? I guess that's weird." So then it goes on a little bit from there, but it's important. I think we do, in fact, I think we know that she knows her name. And Jackie is pushing her on this, but she really is not going to tell us the name. And honestly, when I first read that, I was like, wait, Louise, you've taken this one step too far. I don't think that she would have forgotten her actual name. But then I realized, in fact, that Tookie is only saying this so that she doesn't have to tell Jackie her name. And the thing that sort of helped me to understand that was on page 138. At the end of the chapter and at the end of the section, this is right before we get to this next big section, Tookie is talking about her husband Pollux and says, she's discussing the fact that they're sort of careful with each other in lots of ways, and that's part of the reason why their relationship is so profound. "Oh, he fussed sometimes and worried, and maybe got so mad that it came to the tip of his tongue. He knew. He'd arrested me. He'd married me. And I knew that he knew. But he never said my real name." So there's this sense of this history that's really significant that is not being shared between the two of them. It sort of doesn't come up between the two of them when in fact both of them know it. So there's this sense of her real name as something very significant, even at this point, only 1/3 into the novel. So on page 357 here, we have this question of her name as sort of coming to the fore, coming to sort of a climax. On 357, down here in the section that is titled Tookie's Return, "I cannot remember reading Flora's full name in the book as I read the simple sentence that killed. Her name was Lily Florabella Truax." So there is this sense here of finding out the sentence that killed Flora. And then we find out, 3 pages later, on page 360, in the middle, close to the end of yet another large section, we have this sentence right here that is Tookie speaking. It's importantly italicized here. It says, "My name is Lily Florabella Truax Beaupre, named after the woman who helped my mother, the woman who became my ghost." So you have this sense here of the name, in fact, of being very important, because we are realizing that this ghost who is haunting her is the ghost of someone who was very close to her mother, someone who has been absent from her life, and someone who is haunting both her and the bookstore, who has a problematic, to say the least, relationship with Native American peoples, but someone who is intimately tied to Tookie's experience as a Native woman. So with that, we will close this second chunk of this 3-part seminar on Louise Erdrich's The Sentence. Tune in for the third section, where we will be talking about just a couple of shortcomings of the novel, very little things that I wanted to point out. And then we will be talking about maternity and then looking at the close of the novel. So I hope that section 2 has helped you understand the book a bit more, and I hope you tune in for section 3. We are going to continue this third section of our lecture on Louise Erdrich's The Sentence by taking a look at maternity. So this is one of the strengths, in my opinion, of the novel. Erdrich has this really sort of multifold way that she talks about mothering, and it has a lot to do with the sort of trajectory and the character arc of Tookie, our main character. So in the novel, we have lots of different sort of representations of really what is fairly unconventional mothering. We have Pollux's mom and Tookie's moms both being absent. So you've heard me talk before about, it's sort of the Bambi effect in that, well, it's also like a Grimm's fairy tale moment. So it goes way, way back, way before Disney. But this idea that mothers have to be out of the story in order for true sort of danger and adventure to occur, because mothers generally will keep things rolling and keep people safe. And when you take mothers out of the equation, all sorts of adventures and all sorts of, story ensues. In this case, Pollux's mother and Tookie are replaced by other maternal figures. So you have a lot of mothering that is happening in the novel, but it's very unconventional. Of course, the mother that is Tookie, in many senses, is she's a stepmother, and she's becoming more and more of a mother. But the mother who we see sort of at the center of the novel is Hedda. So she's a young mother. She's not married. Laurent is largely absent, and they have this baby named Jarvis. And it's one of these kind of unconventional things where at one point she says they were going to move in with a roommate who's cool with the baby. So it's this kind of this reimagining of the family, or not even the family, but the reimagining of community and child rearing in this younger generation. But of course, throughout the COVID situation, but also throughout the novel in general, you have Hedda relying fairly heavily on her father and her stepmother. And what happens in that, the course of Tookie taking care of young baby Jarvis, is that we see, again, this kind of growth. We see this change that is occurring in Tookie that allows her to do a lot of healing and to sort of complete her arc as a character throughout the novel. We're going to look first at page 119. So this is a description of Tookie holding the baby. She's uncomfortable holding Jarvis in the beginning. The name Jarvis just kills me. I should have looked up what it means. So in the middle of page, 119, we have this description of her sort of studying this infant and Jarvis, baby Jarvis, studying her back. So the study was mutual. He stared holes through me. He saw straight into my heart and didn't seem to care that it was riddled with cowardice, hubris, stupidity, regret. Those things meant nothing to him. He saw that what was left of my heart was good and loving. He trusted me not to scare him, not to drop him. I blinked to keep the raw tears back. So already in the very, this is only sort of a third into the novel, and it's at the very beginning of our introduction to this baby and to the relationship between Hedda and her stepmother, who she begins to call Mom throughout the course of the book, and this baby Jarvis. So you have this recognition here of this real healing that's happening. This baby, with all of his innocence and all of his wisdom, is looking at her for who she is and is not seeing anything, appalling to him, which is a real revelation for Tookie. So on page 225, we're going to look at the next example of this kind of healing. So here we have Hedda having a discussion. We're sort of 100 pages later. The relationship has developed quite a bit. And it's a conversation between Hedda, who is the biological mother of baby Jarvis, and her stepmother, Tookie, who has had, shown very little impulse toward maternity throughout the book until, of course, Jarvis arrived. So Hedda says, I just want to state this. I am over my sexual adventure phase. Laurent, that stupid movie, etc. Jarvis has taught me there are better things. And also, well, I like Asima. Like her? Hedda nodded, glancing away. I have to say, I'm glad to hear that. And then Hedda goes on to say this to Tookie. Wow, look at you, said Hedda, so normal, so momish and all. I never thought you could be momish. And you're such a good grandma, a kukum, a nukumis, whatever. You love Jarvis. You like Jarvis so much. Love him, really, I mumbled. For some reason, all this was making me uncomfortable, shy, ridiculous. I tried to shake that off because I wanted to be a person who can be trusted with these kinds of words. So then we have this nice space break and another title of a section, which is really nice because it allows us to see this idea of her wanting to be someone who can manage these words as sort of, there's a certain finality about that and a certain sort of beauty in that. It also brings back this idea of Tookie as being very, invested in words and invested in reading and invested in literature, and certainly the power of words and the power of sentences. But what I love here is Hedda, this idea of her being momish and of her being a grandmother, all of that is new territory for Tookie, and it is involving a lot of vulnerability and a lot of trust that she hadn't been able to sort of tap into before. Okay, we're going to look at 237, just a few pages later. And this is a very dark moment. This is right after the murder of George Floyd. And Tookie is thinking of other instances where young men have been murdered. I thought of Philando's companion, his girlfriend, Diamond Reynolds. Why did you shoot him, sir? I thought of Diamond's 4-year-old child talking to her handcuffed mother in the backseat of Yanez's patrol car. I don't want you to get shooted, Mama. I am here for you. So that for me was very difficult to read. This idea of, it's not even, well, it is a paragraph, but it's a brief paragraph in the middle of this novel, and it's absolutely wrenching. This idea of this real life incident that happened where Philando was killed, and his, I don't remember all of these different details, but apparently Diamond Reynolds, his girlfriend, was being handcuffed in the back of the car, and the young child, who is certainly verbal, old enough to be understanding that she doesn't want her mother to be shooted. It's a gut-wrenching look at maternity here, at the kind of trust and the kind of symbiosis between the young child and the mother. So then, right after that, Hedda says, "Thanks for taking Jarvis, Mom." "Sure, honey," I said. So you have this beautiful thing. So you have this very difficult, stark image of motherhood and all that goes into it, and this protective urge and this pain at the child being worried about the parent. And then right away you have Hedda, giving the baby or trusting the baby to Tookie, and then also thanking her and calling her mom. And then this very sweet sort of, "Sure, honey," I said. This, even just the pet name there, is really significant because there's sort of a mundane, very sort of maternal feeling about it that's really lovely. And also, importantly, signals, again, this building trust and this building sort of normalcy that for Tookie is very significant. So a little bit later, while Tookie is taking care of the baby, we have this kind of self-affirmation from her, which is very significant, on 242. "All right, I'd smell of baby pee, but I'd passed my first test as a solo grandma, with a no previous child handicap, too. I'd fed a baby and put him to sleep. Who could argue? I was less than awful. I curved my hand around Jarvis's tiny body and sat back down at the computer." So she's again focusing on everything that's happening around them, the COVID and the murder of George Floyd. But there is this sense of her not only as succeeding, but also sort of internalizing this idea that she's not awful. So there's this sense of healing that's happening by virtue of her stepping into this maternal role. On 270, we're going to see a continuation of this. So right before one of the little boxes here that is actually a different kind of box, it's like a little square X kind of a thing, I'm going to read 3 sentences from this paragraph. Oh, and this is about Tookie as a young child. "I caught the school bus at the end of the block. After I got my homework and tests back, I would bring them to Mom. Lay them on the table. F or A+. She never noticed, rarely spoke. Sometimes she didn't speak a word for what seemed like months. At one point, I decided to become a person who didn't feel so much. I stand by that decision, though it didn't work." So what's interesting is we have this, we have very little information about Tookie's mother originally, but then as the story is moving on and as we have her healing in this kind of maternal role that she takes on as a grandmother, we then begin to hear bits and pieces of her childhood. It's as if she's finally able to start looking at the truth of her childhood and heal by virtue of taking a maternal role upon herself. It's a really beautiful and complicated sort of plot thing where we have the idea of, this stepdaughter who she is not, historically gotten along with very well. The stepdaughter is entering. We have her being uncomfortable with the baby. And, well, right from the start, she loves the baby, but the concept of the baby and the fatherless baby and whatnot. And then we have her as she is gaining trust and building her relationship both with this sort of grandson figure and this stepdaughter figure. She's able to sort of process a bit more about her own maternal experience. And then we have this really striking sort of culmination, I think, of a lot of this maternal stuff on pages 359 and 60. So I have to say, I was kind of waiting for something like this. I think that you can read this as a subtle sort of birth. So my sense is that we are definitely going to have some sort of rebirth for Tookie. I don't know what shape it's going to take, but I felt like we were sort of moving toward this idea of her, because there was so much maternal stuff in the book, that we were going to have some sort of rebirth. And sure enough, I got my rebirth on behalf of Tookie here. So right in the middle here of page 359, this is when she's beginning to figure out her name. My mother did tell me that she'd stayed clean while she was pregnant. That was something. She could have ditched Flora and gone on a 9-month drinking binge. That's true. My mother's name was Charlotte Beaupre. So we have this idea of her mother as making this one sacrifice, and having one sacrifice being to stay clean and sober during her pregnancy, which in fact is a very large sacrifice in lots of ways, I'm sure, for someone with substance abuse issues. But we have this idea of her finally being able to sort of look and look for some sort of grace in her mother, when there is actually not a lot of grace to be found. On page 360, the scene continues. I put her ashes in the Mississippi River, not because she ever noticed the river or gave the slightest indication she wanted that, but because it was a way to think of her as she'd always been, wordless and inert, pulled along by a strong, hidden current. So there is this sense of acceptance that we have here, and rivers lots of times in literature are meant to be read, well, they're symbolic of time passing and of death and of things being always different but always the same. So there is this real sense of loss, but also this kind of perfect metaphor for her mother, who again was wordless and inert, but was pulled along by this overwhelming addiction to substances. So right after we have this idea of her mother being pulled along by the hidden current, we have this next paragraph. My name is Lily Florabella Truax Beaupre, named after the woman who helped my mother, the woman who became my ghost. So you have this idea of Flora, who is haunting the bookstore, as having become her mother in lots of ways. And then Flora is haunting, not hosting. She's haunting the confessional that they have in their bookstore. And the confessional obviously has all sorts of religious connotations, and there is this sense of it as being used in very sort of profane ways. But there is this idea of that as being kind of this sacred place. And there is a thought at some point that's how they're going to get Flora out, and Flora is in fact haunting that area particularly. But in the end here, we have this idea of Tookie as being in that confessional, and then we end this important section of the book. It's right before we get on to Souls and Saints, which is the final section, but also the end of this chapter here on 360. She says, I opened the door and walked out of the sin box. Stained, tainted, human, I stood in a beam of weak autumn light. So there's this idea of birth here, and I think it's not too heavy-handed. I mean, there's this idea of walking out of the sin box. You know, if you think about original sin, or you think about, in any sort of Catholic, maybe all Christian religions, this idea of needing to be absolved of sin when you're very first born, this idea of stained, tainted, human, of course, also the idea of being purified after a confession, when in fact she is not purified. She understands that she is stained and tainted and human, but she's coming out of this box. I'm just, it's occurring to me right now that is a slang word for vagina. I'm not really sure that Louise really wanted us to lean into that concept, but it is in fact a concept. The sin box actually sounds like a word that any, good misogynist would use for the vagina. But this idea of coming out of the box and into a beam of weak autumn light, this idea of coming out of, a dark womb kind of place into the light, we do have, in fact, this kind of birth of Tookie. And it's really beautiful in lots of ways, because this idea of being stained, tainted, human, she's sort of accepting herself for who she is, which is, I think, the most kind of gratifying sort of birth. It's not that she's cleansed and she's suddenly perfect. It's that she is accepting all of her, all of the faults that she perceives in herself. So I think we have this really beautiful kind of study of motherhood. Louise Erdrich, she's one of 7 children. She has a lot of experience, it would seem to me, with motherhood, given that she had 3 adopted children and then 4 children of her own. It seems like she lives, I think, with one of her daughters at least, and works with them. So I would imagine that there is a lot of complexity in her role, both as a daughter and as a mother. And I love the idea of so much of that being kind of funneled into this book in this very artful and subtle and I think very gratifying way. So we do see Tookie going through this major growth throughout the course of the book, from sort of a self-doubting, self-hating ex-con to someone who really sees herself as flawed, certainly, but capable of love and capable of receiving love, and as someone who is not awful. So the novel is told in a first-person perspective, a first-person point of view, a first-person voice, and it's told from the perspective of Tookie. But then there are 3 sections. They're brief, and they come, well into the novel. The first is at page 180, then at 248 and 282. So I guess you could argue they're happening kind of in the center of the book. But there were not enough of them, and they didn't happen at intervals that allowed me to expect them. So suddenly we have Hedda's perspective. So it's still first person, which was confusing to me. It's still first person, but we are talking about Hedda's experience, her point of view. Then we are talking about Pollux's point of view, which, I guess you could argue that maybe people who are in her family get to have a section that is their own point of view. But again, they're too brief. But then we throw in a section that is told by Asima. It's a first-person perspective from her. So it's this strange thing where most of the novel is told from the perspective of Tookie, and then we have, her stepdaughter, her husband, and then one of her work associates kind of chiming in for these kind of cameos, but it's all in the first person. And so I found it just a bit disconcerting. And sort of the thinking on this kind of thing is that if you're going to mess with the narrator, you need to have very good reason to do so, unless it's very consistent or there's sort of a rhyme and reason to it. But I just wasn't convinced that we needed those sections told from the perspectives of those people. So I felt like that was a bit weird. And there were parts of Tookie, this is kind of my larger issue with the book, there were parts that just were not believable. So she read ferociously when she was in prison, and we get the sense of her. I love in the very first paragraph of the book where she's parsing the word sentence and she's talking about sibilance, which frankly, that should have been a red flag for me, because I think even if you read voraciously, you're probably not like a linguistics, parser. So we have her using the word sibilant, and then we have her say that bummer of a word, which I loved. I mean, bummer seems like a word that Tookie would use very frequently and very easily. So you have this nice juxtaposition between this kind of inflated diction, I received a dictionary, and then this bummer of a word. But I also, that disconnect was a bit too much of a disconnect for me in certain places. Weirdly, not in the beginning, because I was so distracted and so starry-eyed by all of that linguistics parsing. But later, it sort of jarred me. So one of those examples is on page 11. She talks about how her former lover, who she is, the dead guy whose body she is snatching on behalf of her new lover, he's wearing a fake vintage Whitesnake t-shirt. So you have this idea of her as being someone who recognizes that and sees Whitesnake as a cultural touchstone, as she's folding his arms, his armpits with their drug cash in them. But then she says she's folding the arms as if he were a disciple of Horus, Horus. I don't know who Horus is. I mean, this is obviously a classical reference, and I didn't look it up because I was like, you know what, Louise? I'm not looking that up because I do not believe that Tookie would know who Horus is. So I like the idea of balancing Whitesnake with something like Horus, but it was kind of a bridge too far for me. I also, the IQ test, so it's interesting to me. On the one hand, yes, we needed to know, in fact, that she is bright. And the way that our narrator, Tookie, says that she had taken the IQ test when she was young, and her mother thought that she had cheated on it. So it was kind of a nice reflection of the mother, but it felt a little bit heavy-handed on the part of Louise Erdrich to be like, oh yeah, this person did very well on their IQ test. it seemed a little bit more than we needed. I think there are lots of ways. In fact, I already believed that she was intelligent. That doesn't come until page 119. I think I would have taken for granted that she's someone who had a lot of intellectual capacity. And then she's talking another sort of nitpicky thing when she is talking about, the IQ test doesn't even come until page 356. On page 119, she is so enamored of this baby Jarvis, but she says at one point that his features were drawn with a .003 micron marker. And, I have one kid in particular who's really into pens and whatnot, so I have kind of a vague sense of what an 003 micron marker is, but I don't really know what it means. And I was a little bit like, okay, wait, Louise, I've followed you to the extent that I totally believe that Tookie has read a lot and she has all of these different literary references, but I'm not really sure that I can follow you to the well, I don't know, maybe in Birch Bark Books, they have like a big, pen section. Maybe that's why she knows that. But it just felt a little too specific and a little bit too, it just seemed a little out of character with Tookie. And anytime you have description that feels out of character, it ends up sort of making you doubt the whole entire house of cards. On page 123, she uses the word attenuated to describe a plaid flannel. In my sense of attenuated, I honestly didn't look it up. Attenuated in my mind just means kind of weakened. So I'm now interested to know what the actual definition of attenuated is. But in my mind, it means something that's kind of weakened. So I guess you could describe a flannel, a worn flannel, as attenuated, but it just seemed so heavy-handed. And it is a repetition. So she says the word attenuated twice within the period of 10, 15 pages. I couldn't actually find the other example of attenuated. This is why I should always have an electronic version. But this idea of attenuated to describe the flannel and also to be using it twice in close proximity just, again, seemed just a bit too far for me. And very quickly, at one point, Penstemon talks about having the urge to leap, and she calls it l'appel du vide, which I totally believe that Penstemon is this very brainy, very well-read young person. But it just seemed like gilding the lily here, gilding the Tookie, gilding the lily, Louise, because this idea of l'appel du vide, there just was no reason to throw in the French part, the French translation. Just, the urge to leap would have been totally enough. We didn't need that kind of extra part. And then on 346, I really had to kind of throw up my hands. I have some kind of not so nice marginalia at this point in the book. On 346, we have this sense that Tookie, which is already very well described to us, that she keeps having the sense that she's going to sort of fly apart. And I like that for so many different reasons. There are lots of divisions in this book that I think very nicely capture the divisions in our country, and the idea of inside and outside with COVID, and the idea of fear, and the idea of things falling apart, as sort of this much sort of widening gyre, this kind of, this idea of things falling apart and of entropy. But we didn't need all of that, and we certainly didn't need the word deliquescence. Deliquesce. Deliquescence was enough for me. This is apparently deliquesce. So she, on page 346, she had this idea of being a porous person. So Penstemon says, I think you're porous. I looked at my arms, strong for Marine-style push-ups. I turned my hands over. I seemed so solid. But in my life, there had been so many times I'd been on the verge of dissolving. So close to it that I'd looked up and copied down a word. So I get this idea of dissolving and of sort of flying apart. Oh, sorry, I almost fell over. But this idea of feeling that so much, this idea of dissolving, that she looked up this word and copied it down. But I was like, wait, you can't do that. You can't look up a word without knowing the word to begin with. I just was like, Louise, this is a bridge too far. And the word, in fact, is deliquesce. To melt away or disappear as if by melting. 2, chemistry. To dissolve and become liquid by absorbing moisture from the air. 3, botany. To branch out into numerous subdivisions that lack a main axis. B, to become fluid or soft on maturing, as do certain fungi. honestly, as I was reading it, I was like, if there is something earth-shattering that really just is going to like bust open this novel for me, then I will allow Deliquesce. But it really doesn't. I mean, you've got these kind of, it's a little bit of a show-offy thing that really bought me nothing, and in fact really brought me out of the moment with Tookie. So we're at, we're toward the end of the novel. We're at this very important moment. She's, really getting to the bottom of these fears and how they make her feel. And this idea of dissolving and falling apart and her sturdiness as a person and as a cohesive identity. All of that is so well done that I do not think that we need this idea of looking up a word, which again, I don't know how she looked up Deliquesce if she didn't know it to begin with. So that is the last of the nitpicking that I will do on poor Louise for the day. We are now going to move on to the close of the novel. So the last thing we're going to do is take a very quick look at the close of the novel. So on page 374, right before all of the awesome lists of all of the books, we have this really, really beautiful ending that I think is actually a very nice extension of this idea of maternity. Pollux is finally back from the hospital. She's there with the baby, and they're all kind of together. They're chilling. It says right here, oh my God, you can't see this from where you are, but in my marginalia, it says, no, because she says, we fell into a dreamy assonance. And I was once again like, Louise, no, come on. Especially here on the last page, because otherwise the page is beautiful. So assonance is when a word, well, the definition that is familiar to me is when words rhyme by vowels. So lots of times we think of words as rhyming only, with consonants, like can't and ant. But you can also have assonance, which just means that the vowels rhyme regardless of what the consonants are doing. And yes, that does sound very poetic and it sounds very beautiful. And the idea of finishing this book that began with kind of this linguistic play, the idea of finishing with the idea of vowels as rhyming and consonants being sort of not important, yes, I guess that's beautiful, but it was so distracting to me because I was like, really? Assonance? Like, what is Tookie? What is she doing here? Anyway, we're going to read the rest of this. Jarvis awakened. We regarded each other in the calm light. I'm going to skip down a little bit. Together, we straggled through a year that sometimes seemed like the beginning of the end, a slow tornado. I want to forget this year, but I'm also afraid I won't remember this year. I want this now to be the now where we save our place, your place, on earth. Ghosts bring elegies and epitaphs, but also signs and wonders. What comes next? I want to know, so I managed to drag the dictionary to my side. I need a word, a sentence. The door is open. Go. So I like this as an ending. I think it's maybe not the strongest part of the novel. I like the idea of needing a sentence at the end. And there was that beautiful part about finding, the most beautiful sentence in sort of all languages, which was go in peace or, ego te absolvo. So this idea of forgiveness and going in peace, which you have to imagine that is part of what resonates. If Tookie is thinking of one of the most beautiful, and it's Penstemann's idea as well, but if you're thinking about Penstamann, by the way, being a flower, I don't think I included her in my list of flowers, but this idea of reaching for the dictionary at the end of the book to me felt a teeny bit belabored, and it felt a little bit this idea of I need a word, a sentence. The door is open, go. So I do like the idea of the door being open. I think it does resonate nicely with this kind of rebirth, that she's pushing through the door of the sin box and she's coming out into this light. So there is a very nice sort of echo of that. But I have to say, that did not occur to me right away. So this idea, and here she's also talking, I think, to Jarvis. I think she's talking to the baby in some ways, that she's going to let him go. She's going to let time go. So it's a really, I think, a very fitting ending in lots of ways. And this book is so rich, and it's such a crazy quilt in lots of ways that it would be difficult to sort of tie it up with a bow. So I think that this is it's a good, solid ending if we just get rid of that assonance up at the top. So I hope that you have enjoyed learning a little bit more about my take on The Sentence by Louise Erdrich. I really enjoyed reading the book and certainly got tons out of digging into it so that I could share my thoughts with you all. So please join me again for something else. Take care. Keep reading. Readers, thank you so much for tuning in today. The lectures really are the lifeblood of the Foxed Page, but you should really go to thefoxpage.com. There are 5-minute recommendations where I will predict in about 5 minutes whether you should or should not tackle Ulysses, or maybe why you shouldn't be so snobby about the recent Leanne Moriarty beach read. There are also talks, no rereading required, on old favorites like Are You There, God, It's Me, Margaret, or Frog and Toad, which is quite frankly a literary masterpiece. There's also this very cool thing where you answer a couple of questions and this cool wheel spins around and spits out a recommendation that I think might be exactly what you need, and it might be something that stretches you a little bit. Come and check out thefoxedpage.com. Thanks for listening, and mostly, happy reading.